NFL is facing investigations from the state of California and also New York over workplace practices and culture. This comes following an announcement by the state's attorney generals last Thursday, with California AG Rob Bonta and New York Attorney General Letitia James working together, saying that the joint investigation will look into employment discrimination and allegations of a hostile work environment. The investigation will look into whether or not the NFL has violated state or even federal pay equity and anti-discrimination laws. The NFL saying in a statement just last week that the league would fully cooperate with the attorneys general. The investigation announcement coming after more than a year after James and other attorneys general addressed a letter to the NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell to address those, quote, grave concerns of the allegations made in a New York Times report. I now want to bring in attorney Dan Braverman. He's a partner and chair at the Employment Department at the New York City-based Romano Law Firm. Good morning. Dan, thank you so much for joining us. Just want to kind of jump right off the bat. California and New York both opening up those investigations. You know, what do you make of all that?
Look, it's big news. It's big news. I mean, when you have the Attorney General from California and the Attorney General from New York getting together to open up a big investigation of the NFL, it's obviously very serious. You know, we all know they're looking into workplace discrimination, hostile work environment. You know, what they're looking to find is they're looking to find any evidence of a culture of discrimination or harassment. There have been reports about racism, unwanted touching, people being passed over for promotions and sexual harassment. You know, as you know, back in February 2022, Brian Flores, the terminated coach of the Dolphins, filed a class action against the NFL and certain teams alleging racism. In February 2022, we had the New York Times publish an expose where over 30 female employees described experiencing unwanted touching from male bosses, being forced to attend parties with their prostitutes, being passed over for promotions based on gender, and being pushed out for complaining about discrimination. And as you just mentioned, in April 2022, there was a letter sent to Commissioner Goodell from 6 states, not California, but New York at the time, where they basically warned the NFL, you got to make improved conditions to the workplace. Obviously, with this May 4th announcement, both attorney generals are saying not enough has been done. In fact, just last month, another lawsuit was filed in California by a former manager, a female manager of the NFL, alleging employment discrimination based on sex, gender, and hostile work environment.
How serious do you think this is then for the NFL, and in terms of its reputation, especially given some of the recent lawsuits that have come against it as well, and you hear numerous states investigating? How serious?
Sure. It's very serious in my view. You know, my viewpoint is an attorney general is not going to conduct an investigation, especially 2 attorney generals are not going to conduct a major investigation unless they think that there are issues. You know, they had given warnings a year ago. Obviously, don't think enough has been done. They wouldn't be bringing this investigation forward if they didn't have enough people coming forward now still saying there are issues and they feel like they must act. It could hurt the league's the trust the public has. It could further, unfortunately, erode the public trust. But at the same time, the NFL now has an opportunity to take proactive steps to, you know, to rebuild the trust, mitigate the potential damage, reputational damage. It's not too late.
Now, do you think they'll actually do that? Is there any plans in the wake of the previous lawsuits that have come down by, you know, coaches and things like that?
Yep.
Do we see any change happening there in the NFL?
You know, I think there have been some changes made. I will tell you that based on this investigation, in my experience in these types of matters, there absolutely will be new policies made. Policies will be revamped. They have to do that. The NFL must visibly and vigorously demonstrate in an objective manner that they will not tolerate discrimination, harassment, or pay inequity of any kind. Talk is cheap. They need to act. I believe we will see changes. I believe we have to see changes. I will believe it will be obvious what these changes are. They were warned a year ago. Unfortunately, we're here now. What other changes will be made will really be based on what the investigation uncovers. And that's something that we're going to find out very soon.
From any experience that you have, or just from the research that you've been doing on this, does the NFL have a hostile work environment?
Well, it's tough to tell because obviously we haven't seen all the evidence, but I will tell you, based on the New York Times expose of talking about 30 women who alleged various issues, we have a number of lawsuits that have been filed. I also, as I said before, I do not think the Attorney General in California and New York would be joining forces to bring a claim unless they really thought they had something. I read recently two quotes, one from Attorney General James, which said, no matter how powerful or influential, no institution is above the law, and we will ensure the NFL is held accountable. Similarly, the California Attorney General stated this specifically. We have serious concerns about the NFL's role in creating an extremely hostile and detrimental work environment. No company is too big or popular to avoid being held responsible for their actions. Based on those quotes, they must have evidence, or they must have a lot of information that drove them to bring this investigation.
Do you think this is part of a national shift really in just workplace environments in general, and not just including in athletics, but in business and in movies and film, to, I suppose, kind of push more respect, push just a different culture than maybe decades ago?
Absolutely. I've been practicing for 30 years, and I got to tell you, it's amazing, and it's frankly, it's fantastic what I've seen happen over the decades. This is the strongest I've ever seen as far as having the government step in to ensure a workplace that is free of discrimination and harassment. Years ago, the things that people would do and get away with, and people would feel uncomfortable about coming forward. Nowadays, people have the encouragement of the government and others to stand up for their rights. Years ago, if you felt you were discriminated against, you might be embarrassed to come forward. You might feel like you're going to be victimized for being, sexually harassed or discriminated against. The tables have turned, and I think in a very good way. I think it's changed a lot in a lot of other industries, and I think the Attorney General in California and New York are now focusing on the sports industry because they obviously believe that in professional sports, that's an area where that improvement is needed. They really got to, in other words, step up their game.
And do you think that these AGs may have any power then, depending on what comes of this investigation, to even enact changes or force changes within the NFL, if not maybe face lawsuits as well from these individual states?
Absolutely, yeah. So lawsuits can be filed, fines can be levied, other claims can be brought. I will also tell you that there are a lot of lawsuits that are ongoing right now, as a number we mentioned. And I think with this investigation, we're going to uncover a lot of evidence that might be used in connection with those lawsuits. If you find out that things aren't being done properly, or policies weren't implemented, or people were ignoring, claims of discrimination or harassment, that could be used against, the NFL and lawsuits that are currently being filed. So there's a lot at stake here. And yes, there are claims to be filed. Other states could get involved. There can be other local entities, et cetera, that can file claims. So, hopefully the NFL has made changes from the warning that was given over a year ago. And hopefully things will be done now to really, as I said before, it's not just making changes. You have to visibly and vigorously demonstrate that this is what your intention is. And that is probably the only way to really get across to people that we're not going to tolerate discrimination of any kind.
Tell me, what is a hostile work environment? I know this is something that's being discussed now in the press as the NFL is being looked at. What does that exactly mean? And I think a lot of people kind of have this understanding. You can come in, you have a bad day at work, it's a hostile work environment, but that's a legal term, correct?
Yeah, it's a legal term. And first I'll tell you a little bit what the legal term is, because it's riddled with, obviously, legalese, as people would say. It's basically where the workplace is permeated with intimidation, ridicule, and insult that is sufficiently severe or pervasive to alter the conditions of the victim's employment and create an abusive working environment. In such a case, the plaintiff, the person who's bringing the claim, must not only show that the environment is offensive, but that a reasonable person would find the environment to be hostile or abusive. Notice that the legal definition doesn't require admirable behavior. You can have isolated, non-egregious jokes, comments, etc. It's usually got to be severe or pervasive. But for the non-lawyer term, the way I look at it is, you can't have an abusive work environment. You can't abuse someone based on any protected category, such as sex or gender. So if anyone believes that they're being treated, I'm just going to say it this way, treated differently, in an abusive, in a negative way, based on gender, based on race, or any other protected category, age, religion, national origin, that potentially could lead to discrimination and a harassing work environment.
Yeah, because at that point, then essentially, I think the purpose behind some of these laws and rules are essentially to make sure that everybody can go to work, be treated equally, and not have to fear being able to do their job or not because of these issues.
Exactly it. I mean, look, the way I always look at it is I always looked at, you're an employee, you got to go to work. Imagine and you have to work. You got to support your family. You got to be able to earn a living. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to be in a situation where you have to work, you're earning a living, and you're being abused by your boss or by your employer in a discriminatory way. That's not something that people should have to tolerate. And for many years ago, not that old, but for many years, that was tolerated, right? That was tolerated. And we have taken steps to have that stop. And that's exactly right. And what I love seeing now is there are a lot more people in the world who are just and across the United States are standing up for their rights to make sure that they and their colleagues who may not have the ability or the strength or the confidence to stand up for themselves are now being protected. They're going to stop this behavior.
Attorney Dan Braverman there from the Romano Law Firm there in New York. Dan, any other closing thoughts? Anything I didn't ask you?
No, I think we're good. I'd say I'm just looking forward to seeing what we uncover here. I think it's an important first step. I find it very interesting, as I said before, that I'm really curious because I know that there are subpoenas were issued. We're going to see a lot of documents. We're going to ultimately learn about witnesses, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot of stories. So I'm hoping that that everything will work out fine in the end. But I'm curious to see what we're going to uncover, and I'm sure that's going to unfold in the next few months. But I thank you very much for having me here, Giacomo.
Dan Braverman, thanks so much. Attorney there with the Romano Law Firm in New York City. We appreciate you joining us here this morning.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, folks.